The stones of Jericho tell a story that's not in any history book. For centuries, many called it a myth, but new findings have left archaeologists speechless. Jericho's walls didn't just fall, they fell in a way no ancient city ever had before. And what's buried beneath them may confirm something far more terrifying, a curse. This isn't just history, it's judgment written in stone. And now scientists are finally speaking out. Joshua 6:20, the wall fell down flat. When you hear about the fall of Jericho's walls, the image that immediately comes to mind is of a fortified city, silently encircled by an obedient army marching day after day. At first glance, it seems like a symbolic narrative meant to teach faith and obedience. But what's striking is the level of detail and precision in this story. It's not told as a myth, but as a chronological event, with tactical directions, exact numbers of laps, and a clear timeline. The Bible doesn't treat Jericho as a legend, it treats it as a fact. Chapter 6 of the book of Joshua presents something unprecedented for ancient warfare standards. Instead of a direct attack, the Israelites follow an absolutely unusual strategy. March around the city for 6 days in silence, and on the seventh day, circle it 7 times, blow the trumpets, and shout. A quick reader might find this strange, but those who understand the biblical context realize this wasn't a military tactic. It was a manifestation of obedience to a supernatural command. Jericho wasn't just any settlement. It was one of the oldest fortified cities in the world. It had double walls, built to withstand any conventional attack. For the Israelites, freshly out of the desert and lacking heavy war equipment, conquering a city like Jericho was humanly impossible. That's precisely where God wanted to act, to make it clear that victory wouldn't come by strength, but by submission. And that's what happened. On the 7th day, after the 7th lap, the trumpets sounded, the people shouted, and the walls fell. But here's an intriguing detail. The text says the walls fell down flat, suggesting a direct and vertical collapse, quite different from the expected pattern in siege destructions. Typically, walls are knocked down from inside out by battering rams or from outside in by invading forces. What happened in Jericho doesn't fit any of these patterns. For centuries, skeptical scholars tried to reinterpret the event. They claimed it was a myth, an allegory, or nationalist exaggeration, but modern archaeological excavations, especially those conducted in the 20th century, began to shed new light on the occurrence. The site identified as ancient Jericho, es-Sultan, started to be examined more closely, and then the findings began to raise eyebrows even among the most skeptical. Fragments of walls fallen outward, intact grain deposits, and evidence of sudden and extensive burning indicated a scenario of abrupt destruction. This doesn't align with the typical wear of a city besieged for weeks or months. It indicates an unexpected, almost immediate event. The fact that grains were found intact shows there was no time for looting or famine, aligning perfectly with the biblical account. Jericho fell quickly after the 7 days of marching. These data surprised the scientific community because they point to a type of destruction outside the known patterns of military archaeology. Even more impressive is that the destruction layer of Jericho dates to around 1400 BC, a chronology that coincides with the estimated period of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan, according to the more conservative biblical tradition. Another important layer of this narrative is the symbolism behind the fall of the walls. In various ancient cultures, walls represented more than physical protection. They were symbols of pride, self-sufficiency, independence. By causing the walls to fall after the people's silent obedience, what God was doing wasn't just destroying a structure, it was humiliating the haughty spirit of a city that rejected his authority. It was showing that even the most imposing human structures cannot withstand divine will. And the most fascinating part, God could have knocked down the walls alone without human involvement. But he chose to involve the people. Why? Because there's power in obedience, even when it seems strange to human eyes. When faith moves, even in silence, the impossible happens. This teaches us that divine intervention often depends on a human response, not of strength or intelligence, but of submission. Now, what to say when archaeology begins to recognize that the biblical accounts of Jericho aren't just legends? What to do when science starts stumbling upon the stones that faith already knew were there? And more importantly, if this story is confirmed in detail, what other part of the biblical narrative might also be real, even if it's still discredited today? Joshua 6:26. Cursed be the man who rebuilds this city at the cost of his firstborn. Most people know Jericho as the city whose walls fell, but few understand the weight of what came afterward. After the victory, Joshua didn't just celebrate. He uttered words that would seal that ground for generations, an unusual decree. Even by biblical standards, Jericho was not to be rebuilt. Whoever dared to raise its walls again would pay a high price, and it wouldn't be with money, but with lives, specifically with their children. A direct warning, leaving no room for ambiguity. What would motivate a leader like Joshua to make such an extreme declaration? The destruction of Jericho wasn't just military, it was spiritual. That city, as many scholars point out, represented deep corruption, rooted in idolatrous practices and distorted rituals. Rebuilding it would not only restore a physical city, but attempt to revive a culture that God had declared evil. Joshua knew that some, in the future, might look at the ruins and see opportunity, but the opportunity would be a trap. Centuries passed, and time, as always, began to erase fear. Until in 1 Kings 16:34, a man named Hiel of Bethel decided to challenge the decree. He laid the foundations, raised the walls, and saw his firstborn die. When he reached the gate, he lost another son, exactly as Joshua had said generations before. The biblical text doesn't present this as a coincidence. It presents it as fulfillment. 1 Kings 16:34, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn. It's impossible to ignore the parallel. The man who defied the curse paid the price with his children's lives, not by accident, but by spiritual consequence. This episode, often forgotten even by Bible readers, teaches us something profound. Some words carry power for generations. Promises and curses don't die with those who uttered them. They remain, and they demand. The attempt to rebuild Jericho was an affront to the memory of what God had judged. It was like trying to erase divine judgment, saying, this was all an exaggeration, let's start over. But there are things that God decides should not be restored. There are stories that need to end, and continuing to try to revive them is like lighting matches over old gunpowder. The result will always be destructive. What's most curious is that Hiel wasn't just any man. He lived in times when King Ahab and Jezebel were leading Israel away from God's commandments. The nation was corrupted, and the sense of fear had been lost. In this spiritually decadent climate, rebuilding Jericho seemed normal, but it was precisely because of this that the consequence was so severe. It was more than a physical act. It was a symbol of how far the people had strayed. The lesson that emerges from Jericho's curse is timeless. There are cycles that God closes with a period. Insisting on reopening what he has ended is walking directly into inevitable consequences. Not everything we can rebuild should be rebuilt. Some ruins are reminders, markers in the landscape of history, so we don't forget what happens when spiritual boundaries are challenged. Another powerful aspect of this episode is how it reveals the seriousness with which God deals with the memory of sin. Jericho was more than a strategic point. It was a monument to what God's people should avoid. Joshua, by pronouncing the curse, was raising a spiritual fence around that territory, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. And when that fence was crossed, the price came in the most painful form: the family. Those who read these stories with modern eyes might ask, does this still happen today? Do words still carry that weight? Interestingly, even without realizing it, many live under the effects of pacts, vows, or rejections spoken years ago, and that still impact their lives and families. The Bible doesn't portray curses as magical spells, but as spiritual consequences rooted in conscious disobedience. This case echoes impressively with some decisions we make today, especially when we ignore warnings given by God, advice left in the Word, or internal convictions that clearly say, don't go down that path. The story of Jericho doesn't end in the rubble. It continues in those who dare to rebuild it. Excavating ruins is more than moving earth. It's digging through time. Every shard of pottery, every layer of ash or displaced stone can completely change how we interpret history. When archaeologists arrived at the site known as es-Sultan, long identified as ancient Jericho, they weren't expecting to find traces of a miracle, but that's exactly what emerged from the soil. Signs that, even without theological intent, began to tell a story identical to what the Bible had already recorded. During the 20th century, Kathleen Kenyon, one of the most respected archaeologists of the time, conducted rigorous excavations at the site. Her findings indicated that the city's walls had indeed collapsed. But the most intriguing part was the direction of the fall. The walls didn't fall inward, as would be typical in an external attack, but outward, as if something inside the city had exploded with unusual force, or as if an invisible force had pushed the walls away. An absolutely abnormal occurrence in the archaeological records of antiquity. Additionally, archaeologists found clear evidence of massive fires, layers of ash, burned structures, bricks vitrified by heat. The city wasn't just destroyed, it was burned to its foundations. And here's an impressive detail. Archaeologists discovered ceramic jars full of burned grains, preserved under the collapse. This might seem minor, but it's one of the most valuable clues ever found in Jericho. In ancient times, grains were treasures. If a city were under siege, the food stock would be consumed gradually, and invaders would likely loot the remaining grains. The fact that the pots were full indicates there was no time for hunger or looting. The destruction was sudden. This aligns perfectly with the biblical account that Jericho fell in just 7 days, without direct combat. Archaeology, unintentionally, was validating the biblical narrative down to its smallest details. Another crucial point is the chronology. Kenyon initially dated the destruction around 1550 BC, which sparked controversy among biblical scholars who argued for a date closer to 1400 BC, based on the internal biblical timeline. Decades later, researchers like Bryant Wood revisited the findings, reanalyzed the ceramic materials, and recalibrated the dating. And what did they find? The exact time frame suggested by the Bible. Ancient Jericho was destroyed around 1400 BC. The academic debate still exists, of course, but the evidence is mounting. Now imagine the discomfort. An ancient text, dismissed for centuries, begins to gain support not through emotion, but through excavation. The stones started speaking, the collapsed walls, the burnt grain, the sudden destruction, the fire without looting, all of it pointed to something extraordinary. And even archaeologists who didn't share biblical faith began to admit something abnormal happened here. This isn't just about validating a verse or reinforcing a belief. It's about recognizing that when the Bible describes events, it often does so with surprising accuracy. Jericho's case isn't isolated, but it may be one of the most striking. After all, it's rare to find an ancient city with archaeological evidence so precisely aligned with a sacred text, especially in a world where many ruins tell contradictory or fragmented stories. Perhaps the most fascinating detail is this. After it was destroyed, Jericho remained abandoned for a long time. This pause in occupation is also confirmed by layers of sediment analyzed at the site. In other words, even Joshua's curse finds a reflection in the findings. The ground lay barren, the city wasn't immediately rebuilt, as if something invisible yet real had sealed it off for a time, and archaeology recorded it with scientific coldness. All this evidence puts us face to face with an intriguing dilemma. Either it's all a remarkable coincidence, or we're looking at one of the clearest examples of archaeology and faith intersecting with surgical precision. And if it's true that the stones will cry out, Luke 19:40, maybe Jericho has been screaming for centuries. We just weren't listening. If this kind of discovery shakes your faith or strengthens it, hit subscribe now and activate the bell. There's more truth buried in the Bible than many want to admit. Leave a like to help this message reach more people who still think the Bible is just a story. To understand why Jericho was judged so severely, we have to go beyond the stones, beyond archaeology, and even beyond military strategy. What was at stake wasn't just a city, but a widespread pattern of wickedness infecting the nations of Canaan. The Bible presents Jericho as a stronghold of corrupt practices, blatant idolatry, and according to several historical sources, even human sacrifice. The city wasn't just a strategic target. It symbolized a culture that stood in direct opposition to everything God represented. From patriarchal times, God had been warning that the Canaanites were filling up a measure of sin. Genesis 15:16. When that measure was full, judgment would come. Jericho, being one of the most visible and influential cities, became the first target. So the severity of the judgment wasn't arbitrary. It was the result of a long history of rejecting truth, abusing the innocent, and glorifying evil. What shocks many people is that God ordered the complete destruction of the city, every inhabitant, with one exception. To modernize, this may seem cruel, but when you look closely at the narrative, you realize that this judgment was preceded by centuries of divine patience. The destruction was sudden, but the decision had been building for generations. Jericho had time and chose its gods. In that dark setting, a bright light shines, the story of Rahab, a marginalized woman, seen as sinful, who did what many kings and city leaders didn't. She recognized who the God of Israel was, and that changed everything. Rahab's story proves that even in the harshest judgment, there's still room for redemption. God didn't spare Jericho, but he saved someone who by human standards was seen as unworthy. Joshua 2:12-2:14. Swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family. Rahab risked her life to protect the spies. She hid men who could have been executed right then and there, and she did it without guarantees. What she had was faith, pure and courageous, and that's exactly what saved her household. When the walls fell, Rahab's house remained standing, literally. She wasn't on the right side of the wall geographically, but spiritually, she was right in the center of divine protection. This contrast between destruction and mercy is one of the Bible's most powerful themes. It shows us that God is just, but he's also personal. He judges systems, but he saves individuals. The city fell because its system was rotten, but Rahab stood because her faith was real. And this pattern repeats itself throughout Scripture and throughout life. What's even more remarkable is that Rahab didn't just survive. She became a direct ancestor of Jesus, Matthew 1:5. Think about that. From prostitute to part of the Savior's lineage. That's not coincidence. It's a clear portrait of God's power to rewrite stories. And while it shows grace, it also emphasizes the gravity of judgment upon those who, like the rest of Jericho, harden their hearts. Jericho's judgment also served as a message to the rest of Canaan's nations. It wasn't just a local matter. It was a sign that the time of impunity had ended. Every city that heard about Jericho understood that Israel wasn't just coming with swords, they were coming with a God who didn't tolerate unchecked corruption. And that inspired fear, respect, and in some cases, conversions. It's no surprise that when the spies reached Jericho, Rahab already knew what had happened in Egypt and to other nations, Joshua 2:9-11. The stories were spreading, God's fame was known. The city knew and still chose to resist. That's the key. Jericho's judgment was harsh because it was conscious. There was no ignorance. There was rebellion. This narrative also forces us to look inward. How many Jerichos are we keeping alive in our own lives? Areas of rebellion that have already been warned about, but still stand, defying God's authority. If he took Jericho seriously, maybe he's inviting us to do the same with what in us still needs to fall. Hebrews 11:30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell. When the writer of Hebrews includes Jericho among the great acts of faith in biblical history, he's not just highlighting a past miracle. He's connecting that event to a spiritual reality that still echoes today. Jericho wasn't a one-time episode. It was a pattern, a model, a warning of what happens when God's patience runs out and faith rises up. And what's most intriguing is that, even thousands of years later, the signs of this pattern continue to repeat themselves. Jericho fell because of divine judgment, but also because of the active faith of a people who obeyed, even without fully understanding. That balance between judgment and faith is what makes the story so powerful. God didn't just destroy, he moved in response to obedience. And this same dynamic appears throughout the Bible: judgment over rebellious systems, salvation for those who trust. What happened in Jericho still plays out in spiritual patterns today, across different contexts, cultures, and eras. In Noah's time, corruption reached its peak, and the flood came. In Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities gave themselves over to perversion, and fire fell. In Babylon, pride and idolatry led to the fall of an empire. And in each of these events, there was always a remnant of faith that was preserved. Jericho, in that sense, is yet another sign that God watches, waits, and acts. He always offers a way out before judgment. But when the time comes, nothing stands in his way. It's impossible to look at our world today and not see parallels. We live in an age where evil is normalized, where modern idolatry takes the shape of greed, pride, ego, and self-worship. If Jericho was a fortress of corruption and rebellion, what do we say about the systems that govern minds, hearts, and cultures today? There's a lot standing tall right now that's actually under judgment. It's just waiting for the sound of the trumpets. At the same time, just as God protected Rahab and her household, there are people today being prepared to stand firm when everything else collapses. And their protection isn't in visible walls, but in invisible faith. Rahab was saved because she believed, because she took a stand, because she placed her trust in the God behind the army. That's a pattern. That's an invitation. 2 Peter 2:6-9. And rescued righteous Lot. For the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials. God doesn't judge without first warning, and the signs are everywhere. The story of Jericho isn't just an archaeological record or a sacred text. It's a mirror. It shows us where we are, challenges what we value, and reminds us that not everything that looks solid is actually safe. Many people today live in emotional, relational, or spiritual Jerichos, relying on structures that God has already declared will fall. Another key aspect of this pattern is collective action. The walls came down when the people shouted together. There was unity, synchronicity, purpose. That also points to something prophetic. God's judgment often comes at appointed times, in moments that gather both ripe corruption and activated faith. The shout of faith that brings walls down often comes after long silence, and it's in that silence that faith is forged. For those who read the Bible not as an old document, but as a guide for life, Jericho is a prophetic sign. It points to what God will do in the future, with the world, with systems, with structures that seem untouchable. And it also points to the path of salvation. Faith, repentance, and obedience. The same formula as always. The only one that works when the walls start to shake. There's something deeply symbolic about the fact that the walls fell completely. The city was exposed. Nothing was hidden. God's judgment is not partial. He reveals, he tears down, and he judges completely. and at the same time, he protects those who trust in him, just as he protected Rahab. That should cause reverence, but also hope. Hope that even in the middle of chaos, there is still refuge. And just as Joshua led the people back then, there is guidance happening today. It's not visible to the natural eye, but those who listen can feel it, and those who feel it prepare. Because Jericho's walls fell in a single day, and there are other walls out there hanging by a thread. Archaeologists are finally seeing what the Bible said all along. Jericho wasn't just judged in it was marked, and the marks are still visible in the ruins today. If God judged a city like Jericho, what makes us think judgment won't come again? If this made you think, subscribe to the channel and comment below. Do you believe Jericho's fall was a one-time event or a pattern of what's coming again? God bless you, and may we all be found behind the right wall when the next one falls.